It's wonderful to be here. It's great to be back in San Francisco. And we have a lot to cover. We don't have a lot of time, and so we're going to get to work. The first thing we're going to do is make some adjustments on your texts. So take out your texts. This is going to be a text study. And, someone like me can stand up in front of you and say anything. And you can thump the Bible and say the Bible says this or that, or their Bible or their scripture says this and that. And my advice to you is never to believe anyone who does that, unless they show you the texts. You have to look at the texts. So we're going to be looking at texts to demonstrate. I don't think we can prove anything, but to support the view that I have. And so we'll be looking at text. Having said that, however, you still really shouldn't trust me, because I chose those texts. I could have chosen a different set of texts, and I probably could have developed a different position. I think I'm right. I think I have the right to think I'm right about this, but you have to be very careful and to always consider and use your own mind when you hear people like me, especially talking about controversial things like war in religion. So, for some reason, the text that you got is not exactly the version of the text that I wanted to work with. So all we're going to do is put some numbers here and a few titles. So the first, some key war texts, that's number 1. If you have a pen, just put it there. Just write down 1. The Deuteronomy text, chapter 7, that's number 2. Turn the page. The next says Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba. There's actually a third rabbi there, an important one. His name is Elazar Hamodai. I don't care how you spell it. Elazar Hamodai. That's text number 3. You don't have page 2? Okay, do you have you don't have a page 2 at all? Okay. All right. How many people don't have the right handout? Okay. So, all right. We'll figure this one out as we go. So, don't fret. Sit tight. Look up. Take a deep breath. I'm the one who's not supposed to fret here. So. Let's begin. I'm talking about religion and war, and that's a very controversial topic. I am approaching the topic. I am a Jew and a committed Jew, but I'm approaching the topic as a person who tries to extricate himself, in this case, from the narrative. That is, my own personal history as much as possible, knowing that that's impossible. And I want to try to look at a phenomenon as objectively as I can, given the limitations of my ability to do so, because one can never be completely objective. And so I'm interested in the phenomenology. What does phenomenology mean? How things work as a kind of phenomenon, the phenomenology of religion and war. And I'm interested in not just in Judaism, or just Judaism and Islam, but also Judaism and Islam and Christianity, Hindu traditions, Buddhism. All treat issues of war and peace. I can't be an expert. One can't be an expert in very many things, and I would argue that no one can really be an expert in much of anything, but we try as best we can. So I'm interested in looking at how religion as an institution treats issues of violence and peace and relations with other religious traditions. So my approach actually does not include God at all. God may have something very significant to do with this, or may not. But the methodology that I'm employing is a kind of social, historical methodology to look at religion as a phenomenon. I look at religion almost as an organism. Religions are institutions. They're run by people. God may have certainly provided revelation to ancients in the ancient world, but religions as they function today function in many respects very much like business institutions or social institutions. because they're run by people, and the general laws of human behavior in groups apply also to religious communities as well. We have a tendency when we think of religion to relate to our own religion differently than we relate to other religions. We tend to say, well, in the Jewish world, we would say, well, you know, we don't do those things. We're not violent. Judaism is not a violent tradition. We know about Christianity being terribly violent in different periods of history. We know about Islam being terribly violent in various periods of history. Today, it's part of the narrative. But Jews don't do those sorts of things, and so Judaism is not a violent tradition. I would argue that that's really not the case. I would argue that neither Judaism nor Islam nor Christianity are inherently more or less violent than the other, that every religion has vectors or trajectories of thought and thinking that tend to be violence-oriented in order to achieve its goals, and they have counter-vectors and trajectories of thought and thinking that tend to try to realize goals or have goals that are associated in a different direction, that are peace vectors. The question is, in my mind, as a historian of religion, is when are the violent vectors activated and when are the peaceful vectors activated? And I think this can be explained by history and historical context. And what we're going to be doing today is to look at Exhibit A, which is Judaism, and to see how Judaism responded to history, and in doing so, really changed its course quite radically with regard to violence against non-Jews. I could do the same exercise with regard to violence within the community, because religions also engage in violence against sectarian or heretical groups that are defined as heretical within the communities, but that's not the topic for today. Okay. Okay. So let's begin with the first. The beginning is easy. I think we would all agree there is something called holy war in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament. Now, I don't think that's something that's particularly remarkable. In the ancient world, religion, and when I talk about the ancient world, I mean the ancient Near East, religion and community and God were all very deeply connected. Every community had its own God. When the community went and engaged in conflict with neighboring communities, the assumption is that the community God also engaged in conflict with the neighboring community's God as well. In the ancient world, pre-monotheistic world, that notion remained in ancient Judaism, in biblical religion, even after the Israelites became a monotheist. There was an assumption that God fights the battles for Israel. We have a lot of evidence for that in the text. Let's just take a look at the first text. Here is an ancient song, a song of victory after the destruction of the Egyptian warriors in the Red Sea. And it says, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously, horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. This is God who's doing the work here. The Lord is my strength and might. He has become my deliverance. This is my God, and I will enshrine him. The God of my fathers, I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. I will exalt him. The Lord is the warrior. The Lord is his name. And then it goes on. I don't think there'd be any argument about the notion that God sanctions wars, encourages wars, requires wars for the ancient Israelites in the land of Israel. Now, there is some question as to whether the Israelites engaged in all the wars that are being described in the Hebrew Bible, but that's really not my job to determine here. There is a session that is next in which you can take a look at the reality or unreality of biblical warfare, texts meets archaeology. That's for the next session if you're interested. In Deuteronomy is a text that really systematizes many of the ideas about a lot of things in the Torah or in the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, and it has a number of important things to say about war. So let's just take a look at the first one here. When the Lord your God brings you to the land, are you all with me? You see? We're on Deuteronomy 7. When the Lord your God brings you to the land that you are about to enter and possess, and he dislodges many nations before you, and here they are as a kind of a menu, and 7 nations much larger than you, and the Lord your God delivers them to you, and you defeat them, you must doom them to destruction, grant them no terms, and give them no quarter. This is actually a command to commit what we would call today genocide against certain inhabitants of the land of Israel, or the land of Canaan that would become the land of Israel, so that the Israelites can possess the land, and the land will be free of any vestige of idolatry that might tempt the Israelites away from worshiping monotheism or engaging in monotheist practice. So there's another case, and it's a very significant one, a harsh one, that you may not, if you're not familiar with this, if you go to synagogue, you read this at least once a year, right? In the synagogue reading, we often skip over it because we don't feel comfortable with it. But it's there, and it's important. So nobody would argue that there isn't something that we would call holy war, divinely authorized, divinely sanctioned violence, sometimes quite radical, against non-Israelites in the Bible. In fact, Deuteronomy chapter 20, which I did not give you, so you don't have to try to look for it here. If you want to look at the rules of engagement, rules of war, as understood in its most developed form in the Bible, you can see Deuteronomy chapter 20. And it includes a series of deferments. If you have certain aspects about your personal life, like if you've been betrothed to marry and you haven't actually consummated the marriage, you don't have to engage in the fighting. If you've built a home and it hasn't been consecrated, you don't have to engage in the fighting. Those are deferments that are listed, and then rules of warfare directed against various communities that are close to the Israelites in their own area, or communities that are far away from the Israelites, probably outside of the area of the land of Israel. And that gives you rules of engagement. The rules of engagement are quite violent by our standards today, including the killing, let's say, in the best case scenario, if you're a peacenik, the best case scenario would be the killing of all men of military age and the taking of all women and children as booty into the community. So there's plenty of material there. So holy war or divinely authorized fighting in Israel was a normative part of life. If it was not, I would argue, the Israelite community would have been destroyed. In the ancient world, there were no police force, there was no armies to protect, no United Nations, and people lived in tribal societies in which if you did not defend yourself or engage in preemptive fighting, quite aggressive tactics, you would be destroyed. You would be absorbed or taken in by other communities that would overpower you. So war and fighting in that kind of environment was a requirement. It was necessary. And in the ancient Near East, before the emergence of great empires, the way it worked was you win a few, you lose a few. You're not usually destroyed. You might suffer terrible casualties, or you may inflict terrible casualties, but it's part of the economy of the ancient world. Social and political, military, and economic situation of the ancient world required fighting, posturing, and that was what it was all about. So fighting was necessary. I argue that, and I think you can see this in all religions, and I'm going to try to demonstrate this here, when fighting no longer is effective, when it becomes there's too much pain, it's too damaging, it's too self-destructing to a religious community, the religious community will find ways in order to ensure that hot-headed people won't go out and start battles that will destroy the community or that will cause terrible damage to the community. But when fighting is deemed by the religion, and I'm thinking of religion as an organism now, right, as a community of people, when fighting is determined by the community to be necessary or beneficial for the community of believers, then a way is found to sanction and to even sanctify engagement in fighting. That's what this story is all about. So the Israelites won wars, lost wars, and holy war was, or divinely authorized war was just the way it was. And then when the great empires began to control parts of the Middle East, those kinds of wars were consistently problematic because they didn't work anymore. The last great holy war of Judaism that was successful was which one? We celebrate it every year. Yeah, Hanukkah is the celebration of the victory of the holy war of the Maccabean family that led the community of the Judeans against the Seleucid Greeks, and that was successful. And if you read the book of Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, you'll learn about the war. If you read Josephus, you'll learn about the war. And if you read Maccabees, you'll see that that war is couched in terms of divinely authorized engagement against the enemy. That was a great victory, but that was the last one. There were two other attempts at holy war fighting against a great empire. Both of them failed, and the destruction was so overwhelming that the rabbis, the survivors, created instruments or safeguards to prevent holy war from being engaged. What were those two wars? The first one was the war against the Romans that's called the Great Revolt in 66. And the second one was the Bar Kokhba Rebellion in 133. The first one resulted in the destruction of the temple, the killing of hundreds of thousands of people from war and starvation. The second one resulted from the loss was so terrible that Judea, which is the center of Jewish life, became essentially Judenrein. That was, Jews were exiled from Judea entirely. Roman legionnaires were given orders that they could kill any Israelite or any Judean who was within eyesight of the city of Jerusalem after that period of time. It was so terribly destructive to the Jewish people that a means had to be found to end the possibility that there would be hot-headed young militants who would decide that God is going to fight the battles for Israel and destroy the Roman Empire. I mean, after all, why wouldn't God destroy the Roman Empire if God, or why couldn't God destroy the Roman Empire if God destroyed the empire of Pharaoh? Right? So we're going to read a story about that, and that's number 3, Rabbi Akiva, Bar Kokhba, and Rabbi Elazar HaModai. Except I don't think you have Rabbi Elazar HaModai there, right? You see that? That should be on page 2. Let me know if you have it so I can raise your hand if you have it. Do you have Rabbi Elazar HaModai written there as well? No. Yes, some of you do and some of you don't. All right, so I'm going to read this to you. It's a story. You don't have to read along with me because it really is a story and you can kind of hear it as a narrative, as a tale. This is a midrash on the Book of Lamentations. The Book of Lamentations is the book that mourns the destruction of Jerusalem and the terrible things that occurred to the Israelites. And it's found was one of the Megillot in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. And the heroes here, the 3 important characters are Rabbi Akiva, least important, but the really important ones are Bar Kokhba and a rabbi named Elazar HaModai. And the exegesis or the comment is on Lamentations 2:2, the Lord has swallowed up without pity all the habitations of Jacob. Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi would expound this a verse, which is, a star will step forth from Jacob, as follows. It's Darach Kochav miYaakov. There's a problem with the translation here, so I'm going to kind of fudge it a little bit. Darach Kochav miYaakov, al tikrei Kochav ela Kozav. Don't say Kochav, a star, but rather say Koziba, Bar Kokhba. This is a reference, this verse from Numbers, from the Torah, is a prophecy that Bar Kokhba will come and save the Jewish people. Rabbi Akiva saw Bar Kokhba. Are we all together here now? Or I'm now continuing. Rabbi Akiva saw Bar Koziba, and he would say, this is the King Messiah. That's Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta, a different rabbi, said to him, Akiva, weeds will grow out of your cheeks and the son of David will still not have come. A slightly different position, right? Pretty forcibly articulated, I think. So Rabbi Yochanan said, this is the continuation of Rabbi Yochanan's story, the voice of crying out is that of Jacob. The voice crying out was because of Emperor Hadrian, who killed 80,000 myriads of people at Beitar. This is at the end of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the kind of last stand of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Ben Kosiba was there in Beitar. I'm going to add a few words here and there to make it clear. And he was there with, it actually is 200,000 fighters, not 80,000, each one with a finger cut off. Every one of his fighters had a finger cut off. The sages sent to him and they said to him, how long will you make Israelite men unfit? By cutting off a finger, you make them unfit for the kahuna, or the priestly offerings. And he said, well, how else is it possible to test them? In other words, his warriors were so tough that he would cut their finger off and they would say, no problem. So they said to him, the sages then said to Bar Kokhba, they said to him, well, let's do it this way. Anyone who can't ride his horse and uproot a cedar of Lebanon, let that person not be enrolled in your army. Okay, so he said, fine. So he had 200,000 of these, that is 200,000 who had their fingers cut off, and then his next set of warriors were those 200,000 of those who could pull up cedars of Lebanon as they rode by on a horse. When they went out to war, they would say, listen to this, O God, do not help us and do not shame us, as it is written in Psalms 20. Do not make us fall and do not go out in our armies. That's an interesting statement. Bar Kokhba said, don't call on God to help you. Don't rely on God. Right? So what would he do, this great hero Bar Kokhba? He would catch stones from Roman catapults with one of his legs and then throw them back, killing many of them. He was tough. This is why Rabbi Akiva said what he said, that he thought that Bar Kokhba was the messianic hero who would save the Jewish people. For 3.5 years, Hadrian besieged Beitar, while Rabbi Elazar HaModai was in sackcloth and fasting, praying every day and saying, Master of the universe, do not sit in judgment today. Finally, Hadrian decided to return from the siege. Okay, now how does this guy, Elazar HaModai, suddenly appear here? We have the stars, the heroes, Bar Kokhba catching ballistas with his legs and throwing them back, and his soldiers were very powerful. But the person who was really saving Beitar from being destroyed by the Romans was not the great general Bar Kokhba, but this little rabbi named Elazar HaModai, who was fasting and praying every day. This is the version. I mean, I'm not saying this is truth, okay? This is an interpretation, right? And Hadrian finally gave up and turned around and said, we can't beat those Jews. Then a certain Kuthian, a Kuti, that's a reference to someone who knows a lot about Judaism but doesn't identify as a Jew and is either a sectarian or a Samaritan or someone like that, who's sort of in and sort of out of Judaism, but you can't trust them, according to rabbinic literature. A certain Kuti came, or Kutai came, and found Hadrian and said, my lord, every day that this rooster wallows in ashes, you will not conquer it. Who's the rooster? The rabbi, Elazar HaModai. Wait for me to do something, and that will enable you to conquer it today. So immediately, this Kuti went into the city through a drainage pipe and found Rabbi Elazar HaModai, who was standing and what? Doing what? What he always does, praying. So he made as if he were whispering in the ear of Rabbi Elazar HaModai. The inhabitants of the city went and told Bar Kokhba, Koziba here he's called, but he was Bar Kokhba. Your friend, Rabbi Elazar HaModai, wants to surrender the city to Hadrian. Because he's like, people are whispering, he must be giving secrets. So Bar Kokhba sent for the Kuthian and said to him, what did you say to him? And the Kuti answered, if I tell you, the king will kill me. That's the guy I'm working for. But if I don't tell you, you will kill me. Better that I kill myself so that the royal secrets are not divulged. So Ben Koziba assumed that Elazar wanted to surrender the city. When Elazar finished his prayers, Bar Koziba sent for him. He said, "What did this Kuthian say to you?" Elazar answered, "I don't know what he whispered in my ear because I didn't hear anything because I was praying and concentrating on my prayer. I didn't hear what he said." That infuriated Bar Kokhba. He gave him one kick with his foot and he killed him. So he killed the rabbi. Immediately, a bat kol, a heavenly voice, came out from heaven and said, cited Zechariah 11:17, "Oh, the worthless shepherd who abandons the flock, let a sword fall upon his arm and on his right eye." It said to Bar Kokhba, "You bound the arm of Israel and blinded your own right eye. Therefore your arm will be withered and your right eye will be blinded." Immediately the sins, or the people, or of Bar Kokhba, caused the sins of the people or of Bar Kokhba caused the capture of Beitar, and Ben Koziba, that is Bar Kokhba, was killed. I'll talk about his name in a moment, okay? So he was now killed. His protector had been killed. He killed the protector, and so he was killed, and his troops failed. They brought Bar Kokhba's head to Hadrian, and Hadrian asked, "Who killed this one?" So this Kuti stood up and he said, "I did it." So Hadrian said, "Go and bring his body to me." So they went and they brought it, and they found a snake, not a snack. They found a tuna sandwich encircling his neck. Hadrian said, "If God had not killed this one, then who could have done so?" And then he recited, "If the rock had not sold him, the Lord had not handed him over." The Romans then killed them, that's the Jewish soldiers. And their horses sunk in the blood up to their noses, and the blood was so deep and swift that it could roll boulders for 40 se'ahs and flowed 4 miles into the sea. Okay, that's the end of the story. What does the story teach? Okay, this is not history. This is a story, a narrative. Who was the hero of Beitar? It was Rabbi Elazar HaModai, not Bar Kokhba. Now, who did the greatest rabbi of his generation, Rabbi Akiva, right? We like Rabbi Akiva. What did Rabbi Akiva think? Who was the hero? Bar Kokhba. So Rabbi Akiva was wrong about that. What this really does is it marks a transition from a period in which the Jewish community and Jewish leadership, you know, there's no such thing as united Jewish leadership. You may not have ever figured that out. But there tends to be, you know, dominant voices and all. But the dominant voices in the Jewish leadership were shifting from one of militancy and relying on God for militant responses to aggression to a less aggressive or a non-aggressive way to survive or to respond to negative forces. So the hero of the story is Elazar HaModai and not Bar Kokhba or even Rabbi Akiva. So Bar Kokhba is interesting. I'll just tell you something about his name. His actual name is he wasn't a rabbi. So sorry, a couple of times I said rabbi. He wasn't a rabbi. His name was Kosba, apparently. K-O-S-B-A. And so Akiva sort of played on that, and because the word Kokhba means star, and there are some verses in Scripture that suggest the coming of a great star, or that is understood in some rabbinic tradition to be a reference to the Messiah. So Akiva thought he was a messianic figure, apparently, and called him Bar Kokhba. But the word Kozba, K-O-Z-B-A, means lie. So if you're Bar Kozba, you are a liar, the son of a liar or a lying person. So his name seemed to have gone through some shifts, depending on who was talking about him. And in this text, you see him being referred to as Bar Kokhba was the liar. Right? So, okay, this is a story. Stories have an impact. They inform the way people look at the world. The fact that this story was included in the canonical text of the Talmud and in the Midrash. There's one version in the Talmud and there's another version in the Midrash. I took the Midrashic version here. Says that it was at least accepted by a large enough community of people to be included in the national literature and the religious literature of the Jewish people. After the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the rabbis developed what I call safeguards to prevent people like Bar Kokhba from motivating the Jews to fight against their enemies. Jews had terrible enemies, just like in the earlier period, but there was no more interest in having them engage in violent behaviors. And so I'm going to move this very quickly because we've already spent too much time. One of the safeguards is to look at all of the examples of fighting in the Torah and in the Tanakh, in all of the Hebrew Bible, and to basically digest them and to reduce them to two types of wars. So that is the next box you have, Mishnah, Milchemet Mitzvah.